The first thing Ben Sterling saw, piercing the dusty gloom of his barn, was the impossible splash of raven hair against pale straw, and then the crimson stain blossoming on worn buckskin. His heart, a creature long accustomed to the steady, lonely rhythm of his isolated ranch, slammed against his ribs with the force of a mule kick. For a stunned moment, he could only stare. A woman, a Comanche woman, wounded, perhaps dying, lay there as if dropped from the sky, an emissary from a world of violence and pain he had long sought to escape. He hadn't uttered a word to another soul in weeks, yet the sight of her, so vulnerable, so utterly out of place, spoke to a part of him he thought long dead. This wasn't just an intrusion, this was a cataclysm, and his kindness, a reflex he couldn't suppress, was about to ignite the most perilous and profound chapter of his solitary life. The spark of an impossible love in a land that bred hardship far more often than hope. Ben Sterling was a man etched by solitude and the harsh poetry of the high plains. His days were a testament to routine, mending fences that sagged under the relentless sun, tending the few head of cattle that were his livelihood, the silence broken only by the lowing of his stock or the mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves of his small, sturdy cabin. Years ago, the laughter of his wife, Martha, and the bright chatter of his son, Tim, had filled these spaces. Now only echoes remained, ghosts conjured by the flicker of the hearth fire on long, empty nights. The fever had taken them, leaving behind an ache so profound it had driven Ben to this remote valley, seeking a quiet buffer against a world that had dealt him its cruelest blow. He was competent, his hands calloused but sure, whether coaxing a stubborn calf or sighting down the barrel of his Winchester at a thieving coyote. His movements were economical, his words few. He'd almost forgotten the sound of his own voice, save for gruff commands to his horse, Buck, or muttered curses at the unforgiving land. Yet, beneath the weathered exterior and the wall of deliberate isolation, a deep well of loneliness resided, a quiet yearning he rarely acknowledged. He knew the land, its moods, its dangers. His eyes, often distant, missed little. The nervous flick of a rabbit's ear, the distant spiral of a hawk, subtle signs that spoke a language older than words. This ingrained awareness, a residue from a life before the ranch, a life he tried to bury, was stirring now. A cold premonition that the fragile peace he'd so painstakingly constructed was about to be shattered. The land itself, beautiful in its desolation, was a mirror to his own guarded heart, vast, a little broken, but still capable of unexpected life. He moved towards the hayloft, each step careful, his shadow stretching long in the afternoon light. The woman, narrow, he would later learn to call her, lay utterly still. He knelt, the scent of hay, dust, and the metallic tang of blood filling his nostrils. Her face, even pale and etched with pain, held a fierce, wild beauty that caught at his breath. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps. A crudely tied bandage on her arm was soaked through, and a darker stain spread ominously across her side. A gunshot, no doubt. He reached out a tentative hand, his fingers brushing her forehead. She was burning with fever. Her eyelids fluttered open, dark eyes, unfocused at first, then sharpening with a primal terror that made him recoil slightly. They were the eyes of a cornered doe, expecting only the hunter's killing blow. In that moment, all thought of the risk, of the trouble she would undoubtedly bring, vanished. He saw only her desperate fight for life, and a profound, inexplicable urge to shield that flicker from the encroaching darkness. This went beyond mere duty. It was a pull, visceral and immediate. He couldn't leave her here to die. He just couldn't. With a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew his reputation for gruff solitude, Ben lifted Naru into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. The short walk to the cabin felt momentous, as if he were carrying not just a wounded woman, but the future itself. He laid her on his own narrow cot, the rough blankets suddenly seeming inadequate. The cabin, his Spartan sanctuary, felt instantly transformed by her presence, charged with an urgent, feminine energy it hadn't known in years. Her skin was like fire. He worked with a methodical focus that masked the storm of emotions inside him. Water boiled over the hearth, the sharp scent of carbolic soap as he cleaned the angry, festering wound in her side, the careful way he tore strips from his own worn but clean shirt for bandages. Each touch was hesitant, yet firm. He saw the marks of a brutal struggle on her arms, old bruises mixing with new. This woman had fought hard. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring in her own tongue, words of pain, of fear, sometimes lashing out weakly. He'd soothe her with low, meaningless sounds, much as he would a spooked colt. He forced sips of water between her cracked lips, later thin broth. For days, this became his world, her labored breathing, the heat of her fever, the constant vigilance. He found himself watching the rise and fall of her chest, a strange tightness in his own. He'd almost forgotten what it felt to care this intensely for another living soul. His Winchester, usually a tool, became a companion, always within reach. The solitude he'd once cherished now felt like a vulnerability. She was hunted, and by helping her, he had painted a target on his own back, a forgotten part of him, the part that knew how to watch, how to listen, how to anticipate danger, began to awaken, shaking off the dust of disuse. The fever broke like a prairie storm, sudden and fierce, leaving Nero weak but lucid. Her dark eyes, no longer clouded by delirium, followed Ben's every move with an unnerving intensity. They were wary, assessing, but the raw terror had receded. He continued his care, offering her small portions of rabbit stew, fresh water from the creek. He spoke little, unsure what to say, what she might understand. He'd simply point to himself. Ben. He'd repeat it. Then a gesture to her. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, her voice, raspy from disuse, whispered a single word. Neru. A name. It felt like a gift, a fragile bridge across a vast chasm of culture and experience. He nodded slowly, repeating it. Neru. A small smile, fleeting as a hummingbird's wing, touched her lips. He found himself noticing things. The way her dark hair, now cleaner, caught the light. The proud, unbent line of her profile, even in sickness. The fierce intelligence that shone in her eyes. He started leaving small things by her cot. A perfect hawk feather he found, a curiously shaped river stone, a handful of late-season berries. He expected nothing, but one day he saw her holding the feather, turning it over and over in her slender fingers, a thoughtful, distant look on her face. He felt an unexpected warmth spread through him, but the fragile piece was an illusion. He found tracks, shod horses, riders who knew how to move without leaving much sign, on the ridge overlooking his valley. They hadn't approached the cabin, but their presence was a cold promise. They were looking. His vigilance increased. He oiled his rifle, checked his ammunition. He found himself scanning the horizon constantly, his senses on a knife's edge. Neru, too, seemed to feel the shift. She'd watch him, her gaze holding a silent question, a shared understanding of the encroaching threat. The quiet ranch had become a silent battlefield, and they, its unlikely defenders. He found himself thinking less of Martha and Tim with that sharp, immediate pain. Neru's desperate present was a more demanding focus, and it stirred something in him that was not quite grief, but a fierce, protective fire. The knock on the door, when it came, was sharp, imperative, cutting through the midday stillness like a gunshot. Neru, who had been sitting by the hearth, stitching a tear in her dress with surprising skill, went rigid. Her head snapped up, eyes wide, the needle falling from her fingers. Ben saw the terror flare in them, raw and immediate. He put a finger to his lips, then gestured urgently towards the curtained alcove where she slept. She vanished behind it like a wraith. He took a slow breath, picked up his rifle, its familiar weight a grim comfort, and opened the door a crack. Sunlight glinted off 5 mounted men, their horses restless. The leader, a tall man with cold, pale eyes, and a neatly trimmed beard that failed to soften his predatory features, was Captain Malachi Brand. He wore a cavalry coat, but there was no soldierly honor in his gaze, only a chilling acquisitiveness. Brand's voice was smooth, like a river stone polished by 1,000 lies. "Afternoon. We're searching for a Comanche, a dangerous fugitive. Caused a great deal of trouble." Ben leaned against the door jamb, his face unreadable. "Haven't seen any Comanche. Just me. Been quiet here." Brand's smile was a wolf's grin. "This one is wounded. Couldn't have gotten far." His eyes flicked past Ben, trying to pierce the cabin's gloom, lingering on the barn. Behind him, a burly man with a vicious scar cleaving his cheek, Cutter, Brand's brutal enforcer, spat a stream of tobacco juice contemptuously close to Ben's boots. "She's slippery, that one. But we always get what we're after." Ben's hand tightened on his rifle. "This is my land. And I said, I haven't seen her." Brand's voice dropped, taking on a silken menace. "A man alone out here, it's a hard life. Easy for things to go wrong, or for a man to simply disappear." He let the threat hang in the air. "We'll just have a look around your property. Won't take long." Ben's eyes were like chips of flint. "Look all you want, but you stay out of my cabin. And my barn." Brand gave a curt nod, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "As you wish, rancher. For now." They rode off, fanning out, their search cursory but insulting. Ben watched them go, a cold fury coiling in his gut. He knew this wasn't over. A few days later, his fears were confirmed. Acrid smoke drifted on the wind, leading him to his north pasture. A large swath of his precious winter grazing land was a blackened, smoking ruin. A message, a warning. They suspected, or they were simply showing their power. That night, Nero spoke, her English halting but her meaning clear. "They hunt me. They kill my family. For a secret." Her eyes, when she looked at him, were filled not just with grief, but with a desperate plea for something she dared not name. Ben felt his resolve harden into something akin to iron. He wouldn't let them take her. He wouldn't let them win. This was his line in the dust. The burned pasture was a daily, smoking reminder of Brand's ruthlessness. Ben worked tirelessly, clearing a wider firebreak, his body aching, but his mind sharp, focused. Nero, her strength returning in surprising measure, worked beside him. She hauled water, her movements growing more fluid, her gaze steady. There was a quiet dignity about her, an unbroken spirit that Ben found himself admiring more each day. They spoke little, but a new understanding flowed between them, born of shared purpose and looming danger. One evening, the scent of wood smoke and distant pines filling the air, Nero finally told him her story. She sat by the hearth, the firelight dancing in her dark eyes, painting shadows on her high cheekbones. "Brand," she began, her voice low but steady, "he is not a soldier. He is a ghoul who feeds on pain. He came to my people not for war, but for greed. My grandfather, he was a keeper of wisdom, the guardian of the path to the sunken canyon. A sacred place, a place of healing, of life for the Comanche. Brand believes it holds gold." She described the brutal attack, the torture of her grandfather, his refusal to betray their secret even as his life ebbed away. She had escaped, wounded, carrying not a map drawn on hide, but the intricate knowledge of the canyon burned into her memory, and a small, sacred medicine bundle, all that was left of her heritage. As he listened, Ben felt a cold rage, familiar and unwelcome, rise within him. He'd seen this before, this same insatiable greed, this casual cruelty, in his days as an army scout. He'd witnessed a similar atrocity, a village wiped out for resisting encroachment, and the memory, the shame of his own helplessness then, had been a bitter poison in his soul for years. It was why he'd sought this isolation, to escape the savagery of men. And now it had found him. It had found Nero. He looked at her, at the courage that blazed in her eyes, the resilience that straightened her spine despite her ordeal. This was more than just protecting a fugitive now. This was a reckoning. The quiet rancher, the man who had tried to erase his past, felt the hardened scout within him stir, shake off the rust, and stand tall. The skills, the instincts, the cold fire needed for survival, they were all there waiting. "He won't find it," Nehru Ben said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "And he won't take you." His hand, almost of its own accord, reached out and briefly covered hers, where it rested on the rough-hewn table. A spark, unexpected and potent, seemed to pass between them. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, then something softer, deeper. The touch was brief, but it changed the air in the small cabin, charging it with a new, unspoken intimacy. The lonely ranch was about to become a fortress, not just of logs and stone, but of two spirits bound by fate and a courage they hadn't known they possessed. They knew Brand's return was not a matter of if, but when. His pride wouldn't allow him to be thwarted. His greed would claw at him until he possessed what he sought. Ben and Nehru moved with a grim, shared purpose, transforming the ranch into a calculated death trap. Ben's knowledge of every rock, every gully, every patch of treacherous ground became their blueprint. Nehru, her movements now swift and sure, possessed an intuitive grasp of camouflage and deception that complemented Ben's tactical thinking. She showed him how to use crushed leaves and shadows to become nearly invisible, how to read the wind for the faintest sound. He, in turn, taught her the deadly arc of his rifle, the best angles for enfilading fire. Woodpiles became breastworks, loose stones were arranged to create treacherous footing, the narrow creek bed a channel into an ambush. They worked from before dawn until after dusk, their hands often brushing, their eyes meeting in moments of shared intensity. He noticed the way a strand of her dark hair would escape its braid and curl against her cheek, the determined set of her jaw, the grace in her movements, even when hauling heavy stones. She, in turn, saw the way his eyes, often so somber, would soften when he looked at her, the quiet strength in his hands, the unexpected gentleness in his rare smiles. The tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each passing hour. Then, as the first gray light of dawn bled into the sky, Nehru's hand fell on Ben's shoulder. He was instantly awake. "They come," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. Her eyes were fixed on a distant plume of dust, a deadly serpent uncoiling across the plains. Brand rode with a dozen men this time, Cutter at his flank, their faces set in grim anticipation. They advanced with an arrogant confidence, expecting to crush any resistance with sheer numbers. They saw a lone rancher, a single cabin. They saw an easy victory. They saw nothing of the steel in Ben Sterling or the fire in Nehru. The first rifle crack echoed not from the cabin, but from a rocky outcrop Ben had chosen days before. One of Brand's point men pitched from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Ben fired again, his shot finding another mark. Cutter, bellowing curses, drove his men towards the cabin, directly into the trap. As they thundered closer, Nehru rose from the shadows of the barn. An arrow knocked. The bow sang. A rider screamed and fell, the arrow buried deep in his chest. She was a whirlwind of deadly grace, arrow after arrow finding its mark, her face a mask of focused fury. She was not just fighting for her life. She was fighting for her ancestors, for her sacred land, for the quiet man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Ben moved like a ghost, firing, reloading, shifting positions, his old skills a terrifying ballet of destruction. He saw Cutter, dismounted, trying to rally his terrified men. Ben's shot was clean, precise. Cutter fell and did not move again. Brand, his face contorted with rage, charged his horse directly at Ben, who now stood exposed near the water trough. "You will pay for this, rancher," Brand roared, leveling his pistol. But as he fired, Nehru's cry cut through the air. "No!" An arrow hissed past Ben's head, striking Brand's pistol arm. The shot went wide. Ben didn't hesitate. His rifle bucked against his shoulder. Brand stiffened, a look of utter shock on his face, then slowly toppled from his horse, landing in the dust with a sickening thud. The remaining attackers, leaderless and terrified, scattered like quail, fleeing the valley of death. Silence, heavy and profound, descended, broken only by the ragged gasps of Ben and Nehru, and the pounding of their own hearts. He looked at Nehru, her chest heaving, bow still in hand, her eyes blazing. In that moment, she was the most beautiful, formidable woman he had ever seen. He crossed the space between them, his gaze locking with hers. The unspoken hung heavy in the air, a truth more powerful than any words. The aftermath was grim. The sun climbed, casting harsh light on the cost of their survival. Together, Ben and Nehru tended to the fallen, a somber duty performed in near silence. They buried Brand and his men far from the cabin, erasing their stain from the land. Later, Nehru built a small, respectful pyre. Upon it, she placed her grandfather's medicine bundle. As smoke curled towards the vast sky, she sang, her voice clear and strong, a song of mourning, of remembrance, of resilience. Ben stood beside her, not as an outsider, but as a participant in her grief, in her strength. He felt a profound shift within him, the walls around his heart, so carefully maintained for years, crumbling to dust. The immediate danger had passed. The sunken canyon remained inviolate, but everything else had changed. Ben Sterling, the solitary man, was no longer alone. He looked at Nehru, her profile serene now against the backdrop of the setting sun. Her presence had not just disrupted his life, it had reawakened it. He had protected her, yes, but she, in turn, had saved him from a different kind of death, the slow erosion of the soul by loneliness and grief. She turned, her dark eyes meeting his, and this time, her smile was open, radiant, a sunrise after a long night. It held gratitude, respect, and something more, something that mirrored the burgeoning emotion in his own chest. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. It felt right, incredibly right. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with the challenges of a harsh land and the complexities of two different worlds converging. But as they stood together, hand in hand, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky above their quiet valley, there was no fear, only a sense of shared destiny, of a hard-won peace, and the quiet, powerful promise of a love story just beginning, a rare and precious.
The year was 1887, and the town of Redemption Bluff was built on a foundation of dust and judgment. It clung to the edge of the vast, unforgiving plains like a stubborn burr on a wolf's hide, a place where the wind was the only constant preacher, its sermons howling through the cracks in the unpainted buildings and carrying away any whispers of hope. The sky was an immense, empty bowl, pressing down on the souls of the people until they became as hard and brittle as the baked earth beneath their feet. Survival here was a form of prayer, and charity was a debt to be repaid with silent, unending subservience. Clara knew this better than anyone. At 10 years old, she was an orphan, a ghost haunting the periphery of the town's consciousness. Her parents had been taken by a fever 2 winters past, their passing as swift and unceremonious as a hawk taking a field mouse. Now, she was a ward of the community, which in practice meant she was the ward of Reverend Hale and his wife, Martha. They had taken her in not out of love, but out of a stark sense of Christian duty, a duty they wore like a hair shirt, its constant chafe a reminder of their own piety. Her life was a litany of chores measured by the rising and setting of a sun she rarely felt on her skin. She slept in a small, cold attic room where the winter wind found every gap in the shingles and the summer heat turned the air to soup. She was a shadow in their home, her presence acknowledged only when a task was left undone or a plate was dropped. The Reverend spoke of God's mercy from the pulpit on Sundays, but in his own home, mercy was a currency Clara could not afford. She was fed, she was clothed in cast-offs, and she was sheltered. For this, she was expected to be grateful, to be silent, and above all, to be invisible. In this world of harsh silence and hollow duty, Clara had one treasure. It was a small doll, stitched from scraps of calico and stuffed with dried grasses. Its face was a simple cross of black thread, its hair yellow yarn unraveling at the ends. It was crude and worn, but it was the last thing her mother's hands had made for her. The doll's fabric still held a phantom scent of wood smoke and lavender, the smell of a life that had been hers, a life with a hearth and a lap, and a love that asked for nothing in return. The doll was her confidant, the silent recipient of her fears and the keeper of her memories. In the deep, lonely hours of the night, she would whisper stories to it, tales of her mother's smile and her father's laugh, trying to keep their shapes from dissolving into the featureless grey of her present. The doll was not just an object, it was the anchor that kept her from drifting away completely. It was proof that she had once been loved, and therefore was perhaps still worthy of it. One sweltering afternoon, a disruption rippled through the tense quiet of Redemption Bluff. A small party of Lakota, perhaps a dozen in all, appeared on the horizon. They were not a war party. They were familiesmen, women, and a few children, their horses lean and their movements weary. They were passing through, a river of life flowing around the rock of the town. They made their way to the creek at the edge of the settlement, the unofficial boundary between the civilized world and the vast, untamed wilderness. Windows and doorways in Redemption Bluff filled with suspicious eyes. Curtains were drawn back just enough to see. The Lakota were a source of fear, the subjects of dark tales told around winter fires. But they ignored the town, their focus solely on the life-giving water of the creek. They dismounted, allowing their horses to drink deep while they refilled their own water skins. Clara had been sent to the creek for a bucket of water, a chore she usually dreaded under the sharp gaze of Martha Hale. But today she forgot the weight of the bucket in her hand. Hidden behind a thicket of willows, she watched. She did not see the boogeymen from the Reverend's sermons. She saw people, tired and thirsty. And then she heard a sound that cut through the soft murmur of their language and the gentle lapping of the water. It was the sound of weeping. A small girl, no older than 5 or 6, was crying with the heart-wrenching, inconsolable grief that only a child can summon. Her small body was racked with sobs. A tall man with a face like carved granite, his hair long and bound with leather, knelt beside her. He spoke to her in soft, low tones, his large hand resting gently on her back. He was clearly her father, his expression a mixture of patience and deep, weary sorrow. But his words, whatever they were, did not soothe her. The child's cries continued, a pure, unvarnished expression of pain in a world that demanded stoicism. From her hiding place, Clara felt a painful lurch in her own chest. She did not understand the child's words, but she understood her tears. It was a language she knew intimately. The sound of that raw despair echoed in the hollow places inside her, the chambers of her heart that still ached for her own mother. The town saw a potential threat. The Reverend, watching from his porch, saw heathens in need of salvation. Clara saw only a little girl who was hurting. An impulse, sudden and overwhelming, rose up in her. It was not born of thought or reason, but from a deeper place, a place that had been dormant for 2 long years. It was the part of her that remembered what it felt like to be comforted. Dropping the bucket, she stepped out from behind the willows. A sudden stillness fell over the group by the creek. The warriors, who had been relaxed, straightened up. Their hands drifted almost casually to the knives at their belts. Their eyes, dark and sharp, fixed on the small, pale girl in the faded dress. In town, Sheriff Callahan put a hand on the pistol at his hip, his knuckles white. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the possibility of violence. But Clara did not see the warrior's hands or the sheriff's fear. Her gaze was fixed on the crying child. She walked forward slowly, her bare feet silent on the dusty bank. She did not have a mother's soft words or a father's comforting hand. She had nothing, except for the doll. Without a moment's hesitation, she reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled it out. The little calico figure, her only link to her past, her only friend in the world. She held it out, her small hand trembling not with fear, but with the gravity of her offering. The tall man, Chaitan, watched her approach, his face an unreadable mask. He saw the worn, precious object in her hand. He saw the earnest, solemn look on her face. He did not move to stop her. Clara knelt in the dust in front of the little girl, whose sobs had quieted to whimpering hitches at the sight of this strange visitor. Clara looked into the child's tear-streaked face and held out the doll. She said nothing. There were no words for what she was doing. It was a gift from one broken heart to another. The little girl, whose name was Zitkala, looked from Clara's face to the doll. Hesitantly, she reached out a small hand and touched the yarn hair. Her crying stopped completely. Her fingers closed around the doll, and she pulled it into her chest, clutching it with a desperate strength. She looked up at Clara, her dark eyes wide with a dawning wonder. Clara felt a profound and painful tearing inside her. The giving of the doll was like giving away the last piece of her own story. Her hand was empty. Her pocket was empty. She felt a new, sharper kind of loneliness rush in to fill the space. But as she looked at the little girl, who was now stroking the doll's calico dress, a strange sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in 2 years, she had done something that was truly her own. An act that was not born of duty or fear, but of a simple, shared humanity. Chaitan's gaze was heavy on her. He looked at his daughter, now quiet and clutching the doll as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then his eyes returned to Clara. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the threadbare dress, the thin shoulders, the profound sadness in her young eyes. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a thank you. It was something more. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the sacrifice she had made. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, the Lakota gathered their things and mounted their horses. Chaitan swung his daughter up in front of him, and she did not protest, her cheek pressed against the calico doll. The party moved on, melting back into the vastness of the plains, leaving behind only the damp earth by the creek and the stunned silence of the town. Clara picked up her forgotten bucket, its weight feeling heavier than before. As she walked back towards the parsonage, she did not look at the faces in the windows. She could feel their judgment like a physical blow. "Where have you been, girl?" Martha Hale's voice was as sharp as broken glass. "Dallying with savages. Did you give them something? I saw you." Clara said nothing, her throat tight. "Answer me, what did you give them?" "Nothing," Clara whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "I gave them nothing." She received a sharp slap for her insolence and a lecture from the Reverend that evening on the perils of consorting with heathens, who were, he declared, soulless creatures, incapable of true feeling. She was sent to her attic room without supper. That night was the longest of Clara's life. The emptiness in her apron pocket was a vast, echoing chasm. She reached for the doll out of habit, her fingers closing on nothing but air. The grief was so sharp it felt like a physical wound. She had given away her mother. She had given away her past. She cried silently into her thin pillow, mourning the doll with a ferocity that surprised her. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. It was the memory of the little girl's crying stopping, the memory of the father's solemn nod. She had connected a broken thread, not for herself, but for someone else. In her desolate world, that single act shone with a strange and bewildering light. She had no regrets. The next morning, the world changed. It began not with the crowing of the rooster, but with a low, rumbling thunder that was not from the sky. The ground itself seemed to hum, a deep vibration that rattled the windows in their frames. Clara, awake in her attic, felt it first. She crept to the small, dusty window that overlooked the plains. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The horizon was no longer empty. It was filled from one end to the other with riders, hundreds of them. Lakota warriors, their faces painted, their horses restless, the morning sun glinting off the tips of their lances. They were not the weary travelers from the day before. This was a war party, a silent, disciplined army that had materialized from the dust of the plains. They halted just beyond the creek, a living wall of muscle and menace, their stillness more terrifying than any war cry. Panic erupted in Redemption Bluff like a flash flood. The single church bell began to ring, not in a steady peal for Sunday service, but in a frantic, desperate clangor of alarm. Men, half-dressed, spilled from their houses with rifles in their hands, their faces pale with terror. Women screamed and gathered their children. The town that had felt so solid and righteous an hour before was now a fragile, terrified island in a sea of warriors. "It's the girl," someone shouted. "The orphan girl. She's brought this curse on us." The fear in the town needed a target, and it found one in Clara. The whispers turned to accusations, the suspicion to open blame. Reverend Hale's face was a mask of righteous fury. "I warned her," he thundered to the small, frightened crowd gathering in the street. "She consorted with the devil's children, and now he has come to collect his due. She has doomed us all." Clara shrank back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was the cause of this. Her small, foolish act of kindness had brought an army to their door. She scrambled to the darkest corner of the attic, pulling an old crate in front of her, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. The angry shouts from the street below were as sharp as stones. Sheriff Callahan, a pragmatic man whose authority had evaporated in the face of such overwhelming odds, was trying to create some semblance of order. He knew their dozen hunting rifles were nothing against this force. He knew that a single arrow, a single shot, would be their end. Then, a small group of riders detached from the main body and trotted forward. At their head was Chaitan, the tall warrior from the day before. He was not in war paint. His face was grave, his bearing regal. He stopped at the edge of town, holding up a hand in a sign of peace, though the army at his back made the gesture feel like a profound threat. One of the men with him spoke in clear, if heavily accented, English. "We have come to see the girl," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "The one they call Clara." The demand hung in the air, simple and absolute, the life of one insignificant orphan girl against the survival of the entire town. To Clara, hiding in the attic, the words were a death sentence. They had come for her. Sheriff Callahan looked at Reverend Hale, whose face was a mixture of fear and a terrible, triumphant justification. "Give them the girl," the Reverend hissed. "She brought this upon herself. It is God's will." The sheriff's face hardened. He was a man of the law, but the law had no power here. Survival did. He nodded grimly and pushed his way into the parsonage. He found Clara cowering in the attic, her body trembling so violently she could barely stand. "Come on, child," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "They're asking for you. We have no choice." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she nodded. There was nowhere left to run. She followed the sheriff out into the blinding sunlight, her legs unsteady beneath her. The entire town was watching, their faces a mixture of fear and relief. They were willing to sacrifice her to save themselves. As she walked, she felt a profound and final loneliness. She was truly, utterly alone. She stopped at the edge of the street, a small, trembling figure in a faded dress, facing the imposing line of warriors. Chaitan dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked towards her, his tall frame casting a long shadow that enveloped her completely. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching her face. He did not look angry. He looked solemn. The translator stepped forward. The silence was so complete that Clara could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. Chaitan began to speak, his voice a low, resonant baritone. The translator's words followed, weaving a story that stunned the very air. "Our leader, Chaitan, says this." The translator began. "His daughter, Zitkala, has been in a deep shadow of grief. 3 weeks ago, her mother walked the spirit road. She left this world." A murmur went through the watching townspeople. "The only thing the child had left of her mother was a doll," the translator continued, his voice steady. "A doll her mother made for her with her own hands. 2 days ago, As we crossed the great river, the doll was swept away by the current. It was gone. With it, the child's spirit seemed to be gone too. She would not eat. She would not speak. She only wept. Her grief was a stone that we could not lift. Chaitan's eyes never left Clara's face. He could see the understanding dawning in her expression, replacing the terror. Yesterday, the translator said, you came to her. You, a stranger, a child with nothing, and you gave her your own doll. He says the doll you gave her, it looked almost the same, made with the same love. When his daughter held it, the stone of her grief was lifted. She spoke. She smiled. You gave her back a piece of her mother's spirit. Clara's breath hitched. She looked at the formidable warrior, and for the first time she saw the father, the grieving husband, the man who had been helpless to ease his own child's pain. Chaitan says that an act of war is understood. The translator's voice grew stronger, ringing across the dusty street. An act of greed is understood, but this act, for one child who has nothing to give her only comfort, her only memory, to another child simply to soothe her sorrow, this is an act of a spirit so strong and a heart so pure that it is a thing of great power. It is an honor that must be witnessed. He did not bring his warriors here for war. Chaitan took a step forward and spoke the next words himself, in his own language, his voice full of a profound respect. The translator's voice followed. He brought them here to see the girl with the mighty heart. He brought them here to honor you. The town of Redemption Bluff stood in stunned, absolute silence. Their judgment, their fear, their petty cruelties, all of it, shriveled to dust in the face of this astonishing revelation. Reverend Hale's mouth hung open, his righteous condemnation turned to ashes on his tongue. Chaitan turned and gestured to one of his men. The man came forward leading a pony, a beautiful creature with a coat the color of dappled sunlight and a mane like black silk. Another warrior brought a thick, heavy blanket, woven with intricate geometric patterns in brilliant colors of sky blue and sunset red. Chaitan took the blanket and unfolded it. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a powerful man, he draped it around Clara's thin shoulders. Its weight was warm and comforting, a shield against the coldness of the world she had known. He declares you a friend to the Lakota people, the translator said, his voice filled with emotion. You are named Wichapi Owangela, one star woman. For you are a single bright light in the darkness. This pony is yours, this blanket is yours, and the protection of our people is yours. No harm will come to you while we draw breath. Chaitan placed a hand briefly on Clara's head, a gesture of blessing. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and without a backward glance at the town, led his warriors away. They moved as one, a silent, flowing river, disappearing back into the plains as mysteriously as they had come, leaving behind only the dust settling in the morning light. In the aftermath, a new kind of silence fell over Redemption Bluff. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe and shame. Clara stood wrapped in the magnificent blanket, the reins of her own pony held loosely in her hand. She was no longer the town's burden, its forgotten ghost. She was one-star woman. She was the girl who had been honored by 500 warriors. Her life in the parsonage was irrevocably altered. Martha Hale no longer dared to raise her voice, let alone her hand, to the girl who was under the declared protection of the Lakota nation. The Reverend spoke no more of soulless heathens. He had witnessed a spirit more profoundly Christian than his own. The townspeople, who had once shunned her, now nodded respectfully as she passed, their eyes holding a new and unfamiliar light. But Clara's transformation was deeper than the town's grudging acceptance. As she cared for her pony and slept under the warmth of her blanket, she understood. She had given away the last tangible piece of her past, an act that had felt like severing her final anchor. But in doing so, she had not been left adrift. She had been given a future. She had learned that kindness was a language that needed no translator, that empathy was a force more powerful than any army. She had found a new kind of home, not within the walls of the town, but in the vast, open knowledge of the connection she had for Gator Bond, built not of words or laws, but from the simple, shared heartbeat of two lonely children and one selfless gift. The plains no longer seemed empty to her. They were full of a silent promise, a silent friendship, watching over her like a single, steady star in the immense and beautiful sky.